Welcome, everybody. I'm Bill McCarren. I'm the Director of Press Freedom at the National Press Club. And thank you all for joining us as we do the run-up on World Press Freedom Day. This is one of 8 events that the Press Freedom Center has put together and is putting forward so that the journalism community and those interested in press freedom issues and the public can get a better understanding of the scope and scale of the issues in press freedom, a little bit about what the center is trying to do to address those, and where we see things now. So we're glad to have this virtual event, which is going to be accommodating to some folks who can't get over here to the club. But I must tell you, we've had very robust sessions here at the club and a lot of enthusiasm in and around the kind of topics that we've been discussing, which we'll touch on a little bit later in a recap of those events. For today, I just wanted to go through a little bit about what we're trying to do here. It's 90 minutes, and it'll be a free-flowing conversation, except for this set piece here. And it's impossible to get to every case and every issue in press freedom in 90 minutes. We're going to try to focus on cases where the center is active or cases where we think there's likely to be, and we hope there is, change upcoming across the next 12 months. Some of what we're going to talk about is underreported activity. Some of it is major activity. But we want to give you a snapshot of where we're all as a group focusing. And we all have strengths that are different and complementary. And so we'll be talking about different pieces of geography as we go through. And we're mindful that also today, the RSF report index has come out. And so there's some data about how countries are performing in the press freedom matrix that they apply. We may quote from that or we may refer to that, but we're not trying to replicate that. What we really want to do is talk about people who are in trouble, people that we want to try to assist, people that need our help and our attention. So ours is going to be, our focus more today is going to be about cases and cases where we think we can make a change or we're expecting a change. Okay, so let's start. The first case, an area that we wanted to talk about was China. China has long been a leading jailer of journalists and has a history of being aggressive toward journalists and journalist adjacent people in their country. We are focusing on a couple of cases of journalists in China. One is Jimmy Lai, who I think is well known to everyone, but he's a billionaire, not in China, he's in Hong Kong, publisher. And the other is Yu Dong. And Yu is a Chinese journalist who is in prison, charged on national security issues, charged with espionage. He's on appeal now. We expect any minute, like today or tomorrow, to hear the result of the appeal. We think this is an important case for a number of reasons. While he's a Chinese journalist, he is in some ways U.S. adjacent in that he was a Nieman Fellow and he's well known to reporters here in the States. Is also well known in Japan. And it's that connection to Japan that got him in trouble. So Yu met with a diplomat from the Japanese embassy 2 days after the Olympics the Winter Olympics ended in, I think that was 2022 in Beijing. And he was arrested in a hotel restaurant. He had done nothing. They were talking. In China, you need to prove espionage by saying that the person was connected to an espionage ring, a known espionage ring. And the government put forward a case saying that Yu was connected to an espionage ring that was the embassy of Japan, which is ridiculous. Japanese government put out a statement saying none of our diplomats are in an espionage ring, and uh, so after conviction, UU's lawyers appealed. In China, when there's a national security case and there's an appeal, it's almost never heard by a judge. It's just all in documents. So it's interesting that this appeal is being heard, and while it is foolish to expect a good outcome, there's the possibility of an outcome in this way. The government has not made a case. It really has not made a case, and there's attention to this matter. So we're hopeful, anxious to see what happens, and we'll be participating in trying to keep the dialogue going for UU, regardless of the outcome here. Jimmy Lai case. We did see Jimmy Lai in court for the first time in Hong Kong. He testified on his own behalf. It was a long series of sessions. And again, there, we think it's unlikely there's a good outcome in the legal process, but we're hopeful. And then there is the issue that Jimmy Lai is in bad health and is he's older, and he has really aged a bit in his time, more than approaching 4 years there. And so we at the center, we hosted a couple of events to support this case, as we did for Yu Dong's case. We heard from Sebastian, Jimmy's son. We heard from his biographer, and we've been watching closely, what happens here. There's every reason, I think, in the world for the government to allow him to come home. He's been punished. He, for a period of time, did not want to leave the country. He now does, I think, want to leave, and his family is saying that. And so we're watching and waiting to see what happens in that important case. I have with me Jody Schneider. Jody is a Bloomberg a person, but she's also she was their person in Hong Kong, and she was the president of the press club equivalent, the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong. And she's here to talk a little bit about the general climate in Hong Kong and press freedom. Jody?
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for moving the laptop over. I'm here with Bill at the press club. Thank you all. So I'm going to talk a little bit. Bill did talk about a few particular cases. I'm going to talk more about the climate there in Hong Kong, and also kind of what the things that happened in Hong Kong can, these the cautionary tale it provides to other places in the world, including the U.S. The RSF number, as Bill noted, that just came out today, and the index. Hong Kong is 140 this year. It's up 5 places. It's down. I'm sorry, it's down 5 places from last year, which is insignificant. But it used to be, its number was more like 70 just a few years ago. And of course, what's happened in Hong Kong. Interestingly, there was a great deal of concern after the 1997 British handover to China, that Hong Kong would become an unfriendly place for media outlets, immediately after, or in the years immediately after. And that didn't happen. They abided, the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government abided by the one country, two systems provisions, and basically allowed not only international press, but local press to operate. There were always confines, and there wasn't constitutional protections in the same way, for instance, we have in the US, but they, and many of us who were there recognized how open it was in places like the Foreign Correspondents Club, which Bill had just mentioned, were places where journalists from throughout Asia and other places in the world, when they were waiting to get into other countries, would come. And we would host them because we were a relatively free place. We showed movies, for instance, in Hong Kong that would not have been shown in mainland China, involving freedom of expression themes. All that, starting in 2016 with before that with the 2014 with the umbrella movement, there was some tightening, but in 2019 when there were the protests, which became very virulently anti-China, anti-mainland China, all that ended in the middle of 2020 with the passage of the law that basically really obliterated any last remaining one country, two systems. That system at that point, really with the national security law's passage and implementation on July 1st of 2020 was the end of that. And that led to the raiding of Jimmy Lai's newsroom, Apple Daily, with hundreds of police officers and other places that had operated pretty freely, like the radio station, locally, the government radio station, like our kind of NPR here, which did a lot of satire and investigative reporting. All of that was over within months, without a shot being fired. That was what was so interesting. Everyone talked about what was going to happen when China came in. Well, China came in in a somewhat quieter way through laws and regulations. And that has continued. It has worsened. We see the RSF number, other indications, and of course, people like Jimmy Lai being in prison, journalists. There is a great deal, and this is what this should concern a lot of us in the press freedom community. There's a lot of self-censorship. And publications, even those operating internationally, first of all, a lot of them are no longer there so robustly. The New York Times moved its Asia headquarters to Seoul because they felt like they would have a much better base from which to do reporting in Korea than in Hong Kong, where, of course, really for years and years had been the place to be. That has continued to this day. There was a recent survey that was done by the FCC of members, and there's fewer and fewer journalism members. Sadly, there are now many more associate members, but the journalism members who responded saying they were concerned, even in regular kind of reporting, like business economic news, things that were not investigative or even political in nature. They say people just don't want to talk to them because of fear that they're seeing their names in a publication will result in that potential knock on the door. So that is the situation in Hong Kong. I do have a little bit of good news to report today, or it was very bad news for a long time. But Claudia Mo has been released from jail. She was a lawmaker. She was in the legislature there, representing the last bastion of the democracy movement. She'd been jailed, I believe it's more than 5 years or about 5 years, and she was just released today. Sent a statement out, and I don't know the details. I haven't had time to learn them, but she sent a statement out also thanking the journalism community for sticking with her and being behind her release. And with that, I guess we're going to Paul Beckett, correct?
Thanks, Jody. Thanks, Bill. Let me look at Russia and the surrounding areas. That is really, I'll start with the silver lining, which in February we saw the release of Andrei Kuznechik of RFERL from Belarus. He came out just after Mark Fogel came back from Russia. We're not sure what was given in return, but we were very happy to see him come back. And of course, Evan Gerskovich and Alsu Kramasheva came out of Russian wrongful detention last August. So those are the individual points of good news. The cloud to that silver lining is enormous. There remain 4 RFERL journalists in prison in that region. Ihar Losik in Belarus prison since 2020, Vladislav Yasipenko in Russian-occupied Crimea since 2021, Farid Meralizadeh in Azerbaijan since 2024, and Nika Novak in Siberia in Russia since 2023. And in all, there are 38 reporters, journalists detained in Russia today, according to the RSF report. So there's still obviously huge repression going on, and you can't really talk about Russia's performance in press freedom without looking at the case of Victoria Rashina in Russian-occupied Ukraine. And you'll have seen the stories this week about how her body was returned with organs removed, with multiple signs of torture. Just absolutely horrendous treatment. So very good news that some people came out, appalling news of for everyone else, really. The other thing we probably have to mention is the extent to which the cases of the RFERL folks, 4 of them still in prison in this part of the world, they're in prison as they watch their employer be dismantled. And in fact, the government that supports and funds their employer is trying to dismantle the very people that they're relying on to get them out of jail. So, your hearts go out to them because, as we know, with Evan's case, with Alsu's case, with every other case that we can, we do everything to publicize it and bring pressure. But these folks are just watching their support networks crumble as the government in the US tries to dismantle the people that they've worked for. So overall, Russia slipped to 171 from 162 in terms of the index. Is that meaningful? I was surprised that there were 9 other people worse in Russia. To be honest, there's 180 countries there, so looks pretty dire. I think also a little lens on the American role of all this. A lot of independent media in Ukraine and the Russian independent media that is operating outside of Russia, focused on Russia reporting, the only independent reporting that a lot of people in Russia have access to, was largely funded by the United States. And with the cuts in USAID, the economic proposition for all of those news services has now been severely undermined. So the US has a role to play here, had a role to play in making it worse, and of course, potentially has a role to play in making it much better. Jim, I think it's over to you.
I think so. I'm not sure Jim is with us. Jim, are you there? So in Jim's absence, I'm going to step in and talk a little bit about Middle East stuff. But before we leave Russia, I just wanted to do a little bit more on the Nika Novik case.
Yeah.
And this is about something the center is doing. And Paul touched on the case and also the problem of the newsroom not being there to support, or the corporate structure not being there to support in the same way because it's in crisis, or it's being dismantled, as he says. So in Nika's case, she was the first Russian convicted under a change in Russian law 275.1, which is a law that has ratcheted up the level of harassment against dissidents, but also against any kind of remnant of journalists. It was the same sort of law where you are not allowed to call the war a war, which is almost like as if somebody said you had to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, I guess. But the case that she is under is one that's of interest to us and of interest to obviously her and her family, but it also is a potential precedent because there's a way to challenge this law. So we at the center are the petitioner for a arbitrary detention case. We'll file tomorrow with the Working Group for Arbitrary Detention at the United Nations, and our nonprofit, pro bono law firm, Covington Burling, did an amazing job on this. I went on to one call and there were 7 Covington lawyers, and I thought, wow, these Russians have no idea what's coming for them. And it's filed in just really incredibly short amount of time, but a very thorough and great attempt to shake this new rule in Russia and show it for what it is. So there's roles for NGOs to step up and kind of underpin what happens and what is lost on the support level in newsrooms. And I would just say about this case, when Nika was taken, December 25th, 2023, so Christmas Day, they broke down the door to her mom's house. No warrant, which is supposed to be required in Russian law. At that time, there was no Press Freedom Center at the National Press Club. We didn't launch until November of 2024. So now 5 months later, we're the petitioner on this. And I just think there's lots of room for need for nonprofits and press freedom organizations to step up and try to support. So we're hoping for a good outcome here in this case, but with caution and understanding that it might not matter to them. Let's talk a little bit about the Middle East, such a huge topic on its own. I wanted to just highlight a couple of things. And then if someone wants to talk about what they saw maybe in the index, I would welcome that kind of participation. So, of course, right in the middle of the Middle East is Gaza. And this was just in every way, a horrific year there, where numbers are sometimes disputed, but many deaths of journalists. And I'm going to talk about some of that. And so CPJ and some of the other press freedom organizations do and try to do a great job on documenting what's been happening to journalists. And I think at the last they can say that they can document that 10 of the deaths of journalists were intentional and were they refer to as killings, and I think that's not wrong. And the reason it is not a larger number than that is that it's very hard to do work like documentation when there's a fire zone like Gaza that's so restricted and makes it's not just impossible for journalists to get in, it's impossible for, say, somebody like CPJ, which is actually going to send in investigators and try to understand what happened. Access to crime scenes, as we would say then, it's almost impossible. So I think when I say I mean our community's ability to speak in a clear fashion on this is impeded by how things are set up and established. But what we're looking at is there may come a time in the next weeks or months when not only Western media is allowed to enter Gaza, but also investigative teams like CPJ's team will be allowed to enter and carry on their work. And while I very much want that to happen, it is a large concern to me how any of these groups are going to be operating in an environment where IDF is allowed to operate. Because to me, the rules of engagement are very unclear with IDF. And so we at the center tried to highlight a case on March 12th. And that was a case of cross-border violence by the IDF toward a mixed group of journalists of 3 different companies, some of the largest companies in the world, Reuters, Agence France Presse, and Al Jazeera, all had teams in an area in Lebanon that would give a good look toward Israel. And they were observing tank activity and tank fire and some other actual fires that were taking place from other artillery. And they had a vantage point on a hill, and they were trying to be visible. They picked an area with no trees. They picked an area that was open, and uh, two tank shells were fired at this group of seven journalists, one killing Issam Abdullah, a Reuters cameraman, one uh, tearing into AFP woman cameraman. Christina lost a leg in this attack. Shortly after that, 37 seconds after the first tank shell, another was fired by IDF toward the same group. All seven of the journalists suffered shrapnel, burns, other kinds of injuries. After that, there was a Browning 50 caliber machine gun that was on the tank that strafed the smoking area, trying to ensure there were no survivors. So what we did was we invited as many as could come of that team to visit the club and tell their stories and show what video they had from that day. IDF promised to investigate. That was in 2023, late 2023. We're now in 2025. There's been no investigation. We again invite them to come to the club and show their report and tell us what happened. So there's no training now. There's no trying to retrain the people that did this. Of course, there's no legal process against them. Any place in the United States where a police officer uses their weapon, that's going to be examined. Their weapon's going to be taken from them. Their badge will be taken from them. They're put on desk duty or sent home on administrative leave till we find out what goes on. Nothing like that happens here. That crew that fired tank shells onto journalists, and they were known to be journalists, drones were circling regularly just a few feet above. They were marked, everything was marked press. Their cars were marked press. They had cameras. It was absolutely clear who they were. You know, anytime that there's a case like this, there is no review process. That same tank crew could have been in Gaza the next day doing the same thing. So the U.S. has a lot of leverage here. We're not using it in any effective way. But I think this is an instructive case to look at just in terms of how does the IDF respond to journalists? Because there's a lot of suggested cloud around the deaths of journalists that have happened in Gaza. Some will say, oh, those were just strikes on buildings. They weren't targeting the journalists, or there'll be claims that the journalists were, somehow related to Hamas. I'm sure there is a little of that, but so that becomes murky. This case is not at all murky, and I think it shows exactly how the IDF approaches journalists. And this is intolerable. This cannot be allowed to stand. And it's something that needs to be solved and resolved before we get to the point that we're re-entering Western journalists into Gaza and people like CPJ who are going to do documentation back into Gaza, because without clarity on this, we're going to have a second horrific problem. We've already had one horrific problem of journalists being killed. We face a potential second horrific problem. So this is why we wanted to focus on that. And I don't have the RSF report in front of me, but I would appreciate if somebody wanted to mention that after this about how Israel performed this year with just a staggering number of deaths of journalists in the occupied territory. There are, of course, other issues in the Middle East that we can discuss. We continue to have problems with Iran taking journalists hostage. We continue to have problems in other areas. I'm going to discuss one case in Iran, and then I'm going to ask that we others who want to say something about this region can speak up. Um, so I I Iran did arrest briefly an Italian journalist this year. The The complication there was that there was again some element of U.S. involvement. So the U.S. had taken uh, an Iranian business person. Well, sorry, they had requested of Italy to detain an Iranian business person in Milan who had been responsible for providing some equipment that was involved in weapons manufacture that was being used in proxy wars and other places. And uh, that that action then was closely followed by the arrest of an Italian journalist. And this was Iranian discontent over the U.S. The U.S. kind of action through via Italy. So there was discussion. The U.S. did not press the case, did not go to court to press the case that they felt they had against this Iranian business person. And shortly after that, the Italian journalist was released. And she's out speaking and sharing her story. She seems to be fine. But I think this just it suggests the complicated nature of the world and how we're never far away from, that sort of retaliatory action for our strategic and, in some ways, thoughtful attempts to prosecute, sanctions regimes and to police business conduct that ends up being part of the battlefield. I'm not sure I can suggest that there's anything we can do in these cases, but it was interesting for me to see how this happened and how this came about. And I don't really want to get too much into this, but there was a half suggestion that somehow Elon Musk was involved in helping to release this journalist. If those want to go further, they're welcome to do so. That's all. That's all I want to say. I'm not sure that happened, but it was part of the whole story. So the second thing I wanted to touch on in this region is Saudi Arabia. And I just wanted to, clarify again that we're many years into past the case of Jamal Khashoggi, and still there's no real resolution on this. And so one of the things that came up this year, interestingly, as far as I was concerned about Saudi Arabia, was and Paul, if you could comment on this, I would appreciate it. There were stories and discussion about how the relationship between the Saudi finance minister and similar titled positions in Russia had led to, in some ways, a result for the people that came out of Russia. This is complicated to me and also came late in the process after outstanding reporting by the Journal and lots of other organizations about what had actually happened and why it had happened. It put me down as skeptical about this, but I do see that there was a great effort, I think largely to rehabilitate the Saudi reputation. But Paul, I'd be curious if you want to say anything about that.
I don't have a huge amount on it, Bill. I do know that we had asked the Saudis to get involved when we were looking at who might be helpful and who might be, have an interest in helping Evan and the Wall Street Journal while also being close enough to the Russians to have some influence on Putin. My impression, unconfirmed, my impression is that some entreaties were made, but rebuffed. So I don't know whether it was meaningful or not. I do see that Putin thanked them, so it may have, but I know there were requests made, but my impression, and certainly I think our collective impression as an institution, was that the request was made and quite early on, and nothing came of it. So there may be some revisionist.
Success has many fathers, right?
Yes, maybe some rewriting of history on that one.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. If anyone else would like to discuss in this region or touch on things in this region, I think this would be the time.
Well, you'd asked what happened to Israel in the rankings. They went from 101st to 112th. The RSF report does say, and you mentioned obviously there were some that were targeted directly by the IDF, and then there have just been a huge number of people killed in Gaza, obviously. So according to the RSF report, it says that close to 200 journalists were killed in 18 months in Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces. So that's just a quote right directly from their report out today.
Thank you. It's a staggering number. Wow. And I will just say about that, I'd say that's probably one of the bigger jumps of any country. I mean, to move up 10 points or something like that is a lot.
Down 10 points, yeah.
Down 10 points is a better way, yeah. But still, I wonder about that. I mean, it's not a huge movement where the death toll for journalists is at such a staggering point.
Yeah, I think if you look at the report, if the scores are based on a variety of indicators, political, economic, legislative, social, how do you factor in 200 dead journalists? I don't know.
Yeah,
but they've still slipped.
Nope, fair point. So we were scheduled now to go India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Unfortunately, Poonam has been called to India. Her father is ill. But I did want to touch on a couple of things in that region. And Paul, I know you were the Delhi bureau chief or regional bureau chief for the journal there a number of years. Remind us of that, when that was and how long that was. And if you want to say anything generally about press in India, I have a couple of cases.
Sure. I was there from 2006 to 2013. And since then, it's been pretty much downhill. I think the biggest change in the media landscape has been the co-opting of the largest national, especially television media, by big companies that have very close and personal connections to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So, interestingly enough, we met with an Indian friend last night who specializes in misinformation in India. And, the newspapers, for instance, have gathered together in this collective to try and check facts and combat this kind of stuff. And then we asked about what about television and television news, where so many people get their news from, and absolutely hopeless. I mean, just not a news landscape as we would understand it when it comes to television in India. So India slipped. Actually, I take it back. India moved up from 151 from 159. I am going in the RSF. I am going to assume that was just because everybody was so much worse and slipped below them, because I do not see things getting better there. And worth single out probably Rana Ayub. I don't know if that was one you wanted to take, but I was just. But she said an excellent investigative reporter. She worked for a very good investigative magazine in India called Tehelka, which stood out even when I was there as being a cut above when it came to hard-hitting reporting. And she's written about campaigns against Muslims and minorities, and she has been appallingly targeted by the Indian government and by enforcement directorate for money laundering, had her bank accounts frozen, the sort of harassment that we see far too often, but that many experts have looked at the charges against her and said that this is all the signs of bogus charges, and it has a Maria Ressa feel to it. You just harass them until they give up. She is not much to her credit, but the persecution is severe and worth focusing on her case, just because it's so egregious, even in a environment where things have been deteriorating for the better part of a decade already.
Yeah, I fully expected that she would be incarcerated or put on house arrest, during the election. And it was interesting that that did not happen, although there were times she had to move her location, I think. Um, but I expected that of the Modi government based on like where things seem to have gone. And maybe this is why they're, in addition to your analysis about where they are in the rankings, uh, they did try a little bit. I don't want to give them credit for anything, but they were in some ways, less outrageous as a government during the election period, and I don't know who that was for. Um, but I wonder if they were playing to a larger audience there. Um,
Bill, it's Kathy. I would just wonder, and Paul may have a better handle on this, how much the election results or the sense of the impending election results, which did not go well for Modi, may have tempered his behavior.
that's what I was trying to get to, but I appreciate that, right? Yes, Kathy. Um, and when we say lawfare, which was a term we use a fair amount as one of the weapons against journalists, this is what Paul just described is exactly what we mean by that. It's a frivolous or vacant kind of legal actions that are just meant to overturn that person. And and I know Mike's going to talk about probably digital security at some point, but this is another area where Rana is just hammered. She tries to keep up an online presence, and it's both. The threats are of a variety, but she's minority Muslim, and so a lot of them are, go that way. A lot of them are because she is not afraid to write negatively about the government, and then a lot of it is just a disgusting.
Bigotry.
It's
Yeah,
bigotry and
totally
sexual
sponsored.
violence, I would say,
Yeah,
threats of
sponsored
threats
too.
of sexual
And yeah,
violence in a way that I can't even really read some of this stuff. It's amazing, terrible. But
I think the other thing to watch for in India, and Kathy, I know you were interested in this area, but with India and Pakistan potentially on the brink of war, I fear for journalists in Kashmir.
yeah.
mm,
And Kashmir has been a place where journalists have been absolutely shut down and harassed and uh, jailed, threatened, blackballed. I mean, what's interesting about the subcontinent is you have India and Pakistan at such great odds, but yet they use similar tactics to try to suppress press freedom, and they use the kind of state-sponsored trolling that you've described. They use lawfare, which Bill has described, which is frivolous lawsuits that are meant to bankrupt or drain the financial resources of a news organization. But then they also are threatening journalists with jail, and it's happening, and particularly in Kashmir, where you have an an effort not unlike what the Israelis are trying to do with the settlements of bringing Hindus in to settle in a predominantly Muslim area, and anyone who reports that is under threat, and some of them have to go into exile. There are a number living here in the United States.
Kathy, since we have you, you've brought to our attention a case of a Pakistani journalist who is here in the States. Did you want to take us through that? Because sometimes we treat these as very distant problems, and they are, but there's a home element to some of this stuff.
Well, yeah, and Bill, thank you for bringing that up. And full disclosure here, Bill and I had a long talk about whether or not it would be wise to even discuss this case. But I think, and having talked to the journalist involved, we think transparency is better. I think one of the tactics that's being used globally here is an effort to silence journalists by intimidation. And Ahmad Noorani, the journalist in this case, is not going to be silenced. So good for him. But what has happened here, I will just say by way of introduction, I'm a longtime press club member who now teaches at the Missouri School of Journalism. And this is really meaningful to me because I teach young journalists. And it's very important for us to send young journalists the message that their work is valued and that we will stand up for them if they encounter some of the threats that we're talking about today. Ahmad came to the University of Missouri a number of years ago. He had gone through a lot in Pakistan. He had been badly beaten as a reprisal for his journalism. He had been blackballed, and yet he persisted. And when he came to Missouri as a Alfred Friendly Fellow, he spun up a website, which is still going, called Fact Focus. And this is one of the sad facts of the world we live in, that sometimes the best journalism has to be done across borders so that the journalists can remain safe. So Ahmad now has asylum here very legitimately because we were all afraid of what might happen if he would go back to Pakistan. But he continues to work breaking stories about corruption at the highest levels of the Pakistani government. And after one of those stories ran a couple of months ago, his two brothers were kidnapped from their mother's home and kept without, just kind of disappeared for a couple of months. Thankfully, they are back home now, but when they returned, they were not in good physical shape at all. And this is really clearly an effort by the Pakistani government to silence Ahmad. And in a sense, his family is being held hostage so that he won't write any more stories about corruption in the Pakistani government.
And, I think it's interesting. I don't know him, but from what I've learned from you, Kathy, that probably won't be effective. But we do fear for his family. They've shown that they
Well,
can.
I think this is
These
a
guys were really
tactic.
terribly hurt by this stuff. It wasn't like they bumped him around a little bit. This was a
No, this is
severe.
very serious, and I think so. What I think this does, first of all, this is a horrific case in and of itself. It's a human tragedy, and I think in some ways we need to call it out because if we don't, silence equals acceptance. And but it's also, I think, an example of the kind of tactics that are being used against journalists worldwide. If we can't shut you up, we'll hurt you through your family.
That's absolutely the case in China. I know reporters who've quit the profession because they were outside China, but the threats against their families in China were so severe that they gave up.
I think I'm going to ask that we jump the line just a bit here. Kathy, you've just had a good chance to go, and we want to come back to you because there's some regions where we're going to give you responsibility. But I think if it's okay, I'd like to go to Mike to talk about the US, which wouldn't normally be this high on our list and might not even make our discussion some years.
It's the elephant in the room.
Yeah, really.
I think, and it's something I think we all kind of have something, want to say something about. But I would say that Mike, who's been both because of his press club job, but also very much because of his AP experience, has been really um, at the sharp point there on a lot of this stuff. Uh, I think we need to talk about that, have that discussion about what's happening in the States and about what we see happening in the future. Mike, do you want to go?
Sure. Thanks, Bill. And thanks, everybody. I'm Mike Balsamo. As Bill mentioned, I'm the president of the National Press Club and a journalist at the Associated Press. I'm speaking today in my capacity as president of the club, which has been a home for press freedom for more than a century. And through our Press Freedom Center is a national hub for protecting journalists, for defending access and responding when press freedom is under threat. We talk a lot about attacks on journalism around the world, and rightly so. We have at this panel today. But we have to be clear-eyed about what's happening here at home, too. Right now in the United States, we're seeing a steady escalation of the pressure that journalists are facing, government institutions that withhold access, legal intimidation, online harassment, an alarming willingness by those in power to test how far they can go in controlling the narrative. The AP recently filed a lawsuit against the White House. That legal challenge is about more than access. It's about whether the government can retaliate against news organizations for independent editorial decisions. It's about who decides who gets to cover the presidency, a free and independent press or the administration. And at the same time, the dismantling of the Daily Wire pool means we're losing the flow of independent, real-time coverage of the presidency by fact-based, nonpartisan news organizations. And that strikes at the heart of accountability. Because if journalists are not in the room, the public loses sight of what power is doing. We've watched as newsrooms under the U.S. Agency for Global Media were essentially shuttered overnight. Journalists at Voice of America, other outlets were laid off by the hundreds, their missions suspended, their futures uncertain. That's a press freedom crisis happening right here in Washington and around the world. We're also seeing a quiet but dangerous rollback of public media. Proposals to dramatically cut or eliminate federal funding to NPR, PBS, and their local affiliates would devastate independent journalism, especially in places where public media is the only consistent source of fact-based local news. These aren't just budget decisions, they're choices that define whether communities stay informed or are left in the dark. And at the local level, we're seeing legal intimidation weaponized against investigative journalism. So take Mississippi Today, a nonprofit newsroom doing essential public interest reporting. It spent months fighting against defamation lawsuit brought by the former governor, a powerful political figure. That lawsuit, even without a judgment, sent a chilling message, right? If you hold the powerful to account, you might pay for it in court. And if that strategy works in one state, it certainly won't stay there. It'll spread and it will silence watchdog reporting at exactly the moment when we need it most. And behind all of this is this deeper toll that too often gets overlooked, as Bill mentioned, the impact on journalists themselves, right? Reporters facing coordinated online harassment campaigns, doxing, threats to their families, everything that we've been talking about abroad, happening here in the US too. Colleagues burning out under the weight of covering political instability, violence, and trauma with, quite frankly, little institutional support in our industry overall. And editors struggling to protect their staff while trying to get reporters out to do the story. We don't talk enough about what that pressure does to people or what it means for the future of our profession if we don't address this head on. And what we're seeing now is that kind of harassment isn't just hitting national reporters or high-profile investigative journalists. It's trickling all the way down to the local level. Reporters covering school board meetings, public health, housing, people who entered the profession to serve their communities are suddenly finding themselves targeted in coordinated campaigns. They're flooded with threats. They're doxxed simply for doing their jobs. Many of them have never experienced that kind of vitriol before, and they're facing it without resources, legal support, or those institutional protections that larger outlets may offer. And it's pushing people out of journalism, not because they've lost their passion, but because they no longer feel safe doing their job. And we need to be honest about what that means for the future of local accountability and public trust. At the Press Freedom Center, we're tracking these shifts, we're offering that emergency support, and we're calling out efforts to narrow the press's role, whether that's happening in DC, in a courthouse, or at a school board meeting. And we're responding with that emergency support, with those legal resources, and with the growing network of journalists, advocates, and organizations committed to holding the line. Because this isn't about journalists getting access, it's about whether the public sees an independent record of what's happening in the United States right now. And ultimately, it's about whether our democracy remains accountable to the people it serves. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about this topic here in the next few minutes. But thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Mike. Many of you may have something in addition that you want to raise about to add to the very well-reasoned comments that Mike just made about our domestic situation. Feel free. I think this will be a time that everyone has sort of something to contribute. But Kathy, you raised your hand in the chat. Do you want to say something?
I'll just say that I was a Washington correspondent for many years, and I think the White House has done a fantastic spin job here of trying to make this about elite journalists. What's really at issue with the AP case is who gets to decide who covers the people we elect. It should not be politicians picking which reporters get to cover them. That's celebrity journalism. And I think that's actually one of the problems that's happened here is what I would call the celebritification of politics. And so Donald Trump is really a celebrity, and he thinks that he should be able to dictate his coverage the way a celebrity does. But presidents of the United States don't get to pick their own personal Vanity Fair reporter and get to decide which questions they'll answer and which questions they won't. So I think the more that we can explain that to the public, the better off we'll be. And there's a long tradition in Washington of reporters kind of running the press galleries, making these decisions. So, and in the past, politicians have actually welcomed that because they didn't want to look like they were picking their own reporters. But Donald Trump has changed the rules.
I think the other also a very troubling element of that is not just picking the reporters and giving access, but being in control of distribution of White House poll reports, which have been the official record for reporting on the presidency for decades. And now the distribution of those is in the hands of the White House, not in the hands of journalistic organizations. And when will it be that they just decide that they don't like what the pool wrote, and so that doesn't get distributed today? At which point they are entirely in control of the flow of information, both on the front end by deciding who gets to cover them, and on the back end by deciding what gets broadcast to people interested in what's happening with the presidency. So they've just taken control of something that had been a pretty good check and balance situation with the media, and they've just blown right through that. And what I will be interested to see, as Mike and I have discussed, over the next 3 or 4 or 5 months is, as this gets worse, which I think inevitably will, or I think it would be safe to say every news executive in America thinks it will get worse and are preparing for that. What are they going to do about it? Are the broadcasters going to say, oh, this only applies to the wires, so it doesn't matter to us, and we're getting what we need? Or are they going to say, this is a restriction on the freedom of the press, and so we're going to take collective action to try and confront it? And that, to me, is a moment where we will see either solidarity among US news institutions in the face of these kinds of acts, or we will see it splinter, and once it splinters, it won't come back.
I don't know if Jim has anything he wants to add on that front.
Happy to have
Absolutely.
Jim Sciutto. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey guys, good to see you. Sorry, I was coming from a doctor's appointment with my son. absolutely agree. Unity matters, and we're seeing that happen in some respects with universities and law firms, and not in others. And I fundamentally don't understand, given there's clearly strength in numbers. But um, the the drip drip makes it more possible, right? Because it's an issue here you don't respond to, maybe wait for the next one, etc. But before you know it, you have a pattern, and there's a lack of unity, and that's concerning. And I hope my bosses see the light that there's shared interest here, right? That there's not a good outcome where you get largely what you need as a broadcaster, but others suffer because, of course, we all benefit from not just the fruits of the coverage, but also the principle. So I think you're right to identify that point. I guess I'm curious is, and you all have more experience, I imagine, particularly the AP going through what you're going through. When you reach out to the other outlets, do you get fulsome support or do you get waffling?
Yeah, it's a good question. This came up yesterday on our domestic press freedom panel, right? And I think, I think there's been pretty wide support for the AP for all the reasons that we've talked about, the need for a free and independent press, and the realization that, this is about, this issue in particular is about whether the government can control it, independent editorial decisions, and if the government can tell a newsroom what it can and can't say, the public should be just as concerned that the government could tell the public and any member of the public what they can and can't say. And the elimination of the wire slot after a judge found, clear retaliation, uh, further erodes that sort of need for fact-based, independent, nonpartisan news coverage from the White House. That's sort of like real-time coverage. I think the one other point on the White House side of it is that we're talking about reporters who are covering the president day in and day out on holidays, on weekends. It is the sort of first line of information about every major incident or major event that happens in the world involving, the leader of the United States, and that can't be lost. But I think, the question is, and I'll throw this a little bit to Paul, because we talked a lot about this yesterday, is, what happens if there is a sort of next moment, right? Can organizations sort of band together as a broader press freedom community? Or is it too fractured? And were there lessons, we talked about this yesterday, were there lessons from, Evan's case or others that we could use as examples of where folks could be working together?
So in the reason I have some hope is exactly what happened with Evan's case, which was a really unified and very widespread effort across the whole media. And it was one of the really inspiring things about that otherwise dreadful situation was the extent to which we at the Journal received extraordinary support from across the industry. I do think, as I think we touched on yesterday, in some cases in the US, it's more complicated, not less, because you are dealing with a government that you are also dealing with every single day. And most people aren't, very few other organizations had Russian interests that could potentially be jeopardized by supporting our campaign to get Evan released. That is not the case here. I would still hope for bravery. But I think that realistically, I think a number of news organizations might say, of course, we support you. We'd love to help, but, we can't jeopardize for our audiences or for our shareholders or anything. We can't jeopardize our situation, and we have to pursue that separately. So one of the questions I have, and the answer may be literally coming out of the camera at us, is who is in a position to speak, who's in a position to speak for the US media industry, and who is in a position to stand up for the things that everybody would like to stand up for, would like to stand up for, but has some nervousness about doing it publicly. Because if you are any other industry, you will have a organization in Washington that goes to bat for you on things like this. right? And which you can effectively support financially and with time and money and effort, but you are not, but you can shield yourself a little bit by having an association go out in front of you and take on the mission. I look around and the only one I see is the National Press Club, because I don't see that there is a unifying body or even a organization that all of the potentially affected news outlets actually sign up for. So it will be very fragmented unless I think someone steps in and acts as a bit of a shield, but also a bit of a catalyst to make sure that the industry stays unified against threats like this. I'd be interested, Mike and Jim, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, because maybe that organization is out there. I just don't know what it is, apart from the NPC.
Yeah, I mean, there are associations, but even when there is an association that is wide-ranging and represents an industry like legal, I don't really see how something like the Bar Association of the Trial Lawyers or whatever, acted in the way you're describing to fill the gap there and speak universally for law firms as they were being picked off, one after another and shaken down by the president.
But who does do it for news organizations?
Yeah, no, I don't. No, there aren't. I mean, yeah, we lack that. So,
I mean, very often those organizations are pushed by their constituents, right, to say we can't say it, but please say it.
Yeah,
and I just, I don't see that for journalism.
I think that's a great idea, Paul. I agree with you. And but I'll say one other thing. I'll throw one other thing out there. And that is what are people afraid of? And I say this as somebody who's self-deported from Washington, but what are people afraid of? Losing access.
Yeah.
And that is what celebrity journalism is all about. It's about giving you access in return for your docility. And I think, if the press can collectively say, as somebody who now lives out in the middle of the country, if people said, you know what, we're not that we're not going to pay attention to the White House, we will. I mean, obviously, it's very important. The president's very important. But we're going to start paying more attention to people who want to talk to us. And it is expensive, but get out there in the country and talk to people about how are Donald Trump's policies working for you? What are the problems that you have as an individual? And put those voices in print on our air. And suddenly the access is a little bit less important. And so I think we have to, if Donald Trump breaks us of access journalism, well, that's a great legacy for him to have.
I might just add to that. I wonder if it's not just about access, right? It's about what our corporate parents will and won't do to back our mission, right? Because you've seen, I mean, if you're working at CBS right now, you're having a very direct experience of that. If you worked at ABC, you've seen it. Washington Post, right? And listen, I don't single those out because out of spite, or certainly sanctimony, because we could be next, right? We've got a corporate parent too, and I don't know what that battle might be for CNN, but I could protect them, So that might even be the bigger fear, right? And that would be a case where we'd need folks, and maybe it's folks in this room, this virtual room, would be willing to speak that truth, right? And then the risk then is less an access issue with the administration. The risk is that your bosses aren't happy with you, which is no small thing.
I think those are good points, Jim. I do think one of the things that's happening on the corporate side, that just from a practical matter, is they are moving resources into budget lines to defend against potential litigation and to ratchet up insurance and to do things like this that they would not be doing, under normal circumstances. And so, one of the things the RSF report talks about today, I guess, is the financial aspect of insecurity. And, we are all, in a way, by making the moves that are the right moves to make in this climate, just to protect your own business, as opposed to what, like Paul was saying, talk about the universal problem. There is more financial risk being put on all of these organizations, and the margins were plenty thin anyway. So that is a pressure, and that's real. And there's no documentation on it, but we kind of know that's happening.
I think it's a fear, as we discussed a bit. Yes, I think it's a fear among smaller operators, also just from a threat perspective.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, you can just get wiped out with one lawsuit. So I know in that world of Substack, small operators, which has been the trend for US media for the last several years, terrified that one misstep will mean, or not even one misstep, one unpopular article will mean financial ruin, and that's that.
We had a panel today where we had the founder of TV Rain, a Russian independent outlet, speaking. It was very good. And one of the things that he was talking about was Russian disinformation, and I promise this will come back to the U.S. Discussion. And he was talking about the shift in Russian disinformation or approach, where it used to be that the Russian government would be out there arguing that the communist system was a better system than the capitalist system, and that they now have completely shifted, and they don't say that anymore. What they say is, we're bad. We might be bad. Like, we're bad, but the other people are also bad. The American system, the capitalist system.
At least we're not hypocrites.
Yeah, yeah. And when he's saying this, I'm also thinking, yes, I have seen this happen, but it just didn't occur to me the same way. But there's also an element of that in what's happening here, right? So, I mean, that when he's sort of discussing that, I'm thinking, like, that's what our leadership sometimes says. It's like they don't disguise that they're bad or that they have faults or whatever, but they're always saying about the other guy also has one misgiving or one problem. We have a lot to learn, I think, from exiled Russians and others who have come through these authoritarian systems. And we're not there yet. We're not there yet, but
no, I had a group of there were a group of journalists from different countries in the Middle East visiting us recently, and I said to them, I need advice from you because I think we do have to reach out to our colleagues from other countries who have experienced authoritarianism and find out what works and what doesn't, because that's what we have right now.
We're coming down to time here. Jody wants to get in on something about China. Kathy, I'm going to ask you to do something about Latin America because we haven't even gotten there yet. And I think we should end with like a go around and give everybody like a one thing they want to talk about, just like one point they want to make. And that should get us, we have 15 minutes. So thank you all. Jody.
Yeah, the point I wanted to make, and it's kind of almost a mirror point of what Kathy's saying, is this gives, what's happening in the US is giving a great glee and is also cover to places like China, which, by the way, is 178th on the RSF list this year. I guess North Korea and somebody else more terrible is beneath them. But they basically, this is what they say. Look, they have constitutional protection for their journalists, but it really doesn't matter. And what we're doing, at least we're clear on what our rules are. And I have a friend, who's a journalist operating in China and says, that's what the government, they're basically saying, see, we're doing it the right way. They're doing it in a messy kind of way, what they're doing to their journalists. So it's, again, one of these, what is our reputation around the world? But to me, that's particularly chilling. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Kathy, do you want to talk about Latin America?
Yeah, I'm going to talk. I'll just talk I'll talk briefly about the global South because we had talked about Africa too, and one of the countries, the country that is at the absolute bottom is Eritrea, and but the interesting thing, Africa obviously, is a huge continent. There's Eritrea. The president has actually been sued for human crimes against humanity. There's a journalist there who has been in jail for 23 years. And so, but there are parts of Africa that are rank higher on the RSF index than the United States. So it's a very mixed bag. But what I will say, I think the key thing about Africa is how it has been affected by the loss of the U.S. Agency for Global Media outlets. This is an area where there are millions of people who listen to VOA broadcasts in languages like Hausa. And there were cables that were revealed in the discovery and in the lawsuits that have been filed to try to revive VOA. And those cables talked about, these are U.S. diplomats talking about how the retreat of U.S. media has opened the field for Russian influence, Chinese influence. And I can say I was in West Africa a couple of years ago on a training program. I was helping to train journalists in Niger, and it was so obvious how much the Chinese and the Russians work and how much propaganda and disinformation was in the conversation there, the social media. And so I think our retreat, it's really puzzling why the US government would choose to retreat from there. So that's, I think, a key point about Africa. And I think to points that other people have made, I met wonderful journalists, incredibly brave people there who are now more exposed than ever because the United States is no longer acting as a guardrail for press freedom in the way that it did before. The United States government is obviously incredibly powerful, incredibly rich, and if it disapproves of the way people are being treated, it has an impact. This is greenlit dictators, and then I'll just move very quickly to South America. Same thing. There are cases of journalists. I'm thinking of Gustavo Gorriti, who's one of the most renowned investigative journalists in Latin America, who has been under enormous pressure, threatened with jail by the very corrupt politicians whom his work has exposed. We see Jose Zamora, one of the really distinguished newspaper publishers from Guatemala. He's been exonerated. There was a trumped-up charge brought against him by a president he didn't like. That president is gone. He's been essentially exonerated, and he's still in jail. So I think when you see, as one journalist said to me, when there's an authoritarian in Washington, authoritarians elsewhere feel much more free to act.
I think that's right, Kathy, and it's a good point to make. We appreciate all of that. Yes, and the one gentleman you were talking about, DeWatt, who's got the 23-year case, is also a Swedish, I think, or something in Scandinavia.
His legal team is from Sweden, and
but he has dual citizenship.
Oh, right. That may be true. That may explain.
And has not been able to be seen by his home country, which is for 23 years, which is, I mean, by his other country. Let's go around again, one round again, and I think let's highlight either cases we want to put a focus on or points we want to make. I'm going to offer one, and then to give you guys a little time to get your yours together. I don't think we've done enough today really to talk about what's happened with the Agency for Global Media and the umbrella groups. There are little gains in court back and forth where it looks like maybe something's going to happen. The other day, some funding was restored for Radio Free Europe. It's going to amount to maybe additional funding for April, and then which has already passed, and then additional funding for maybe to take them to September, the end of the fiscal year. But it's all very uncertain. Right now, they're working. Other parts of it, like MBN, they're not working. Radio Free Asia, almost all are either are furloughed. It's put hundreds of journalists out of work. We're losing that value, as Kathy mentioned about programming to Africa, and others, Paul has mentioned about programming to Russia, I think. We're losing in so many ways here. And the teams assembled to kind of produce these shows are all-star teams. I mean, they're people with these language skills that are hard to find, and they were all kind of assembled in certain places, and now they're going to be dispersed. So even if we do return, how are we returning, and what are we allowed to say? And I want to talk just quickly about some of the things the center is doing to try to support. So there are journalists that have visa problems, and Kathy's working a lot on this as well with the center and on her own. There are journalists that face deportation, that need to change their visa status in order to stay, or that need to follow some other strategies. And some of them are going to be going into visa structures that will not allow them to work for periods of months legally. So the center is trying to support like a couple of Cambodian citizens who are working for RFA, who are going to need to make some visa changes. And I'm not saying their names because I think that's probably not a good thing right now, but they're going to have a period where they will not have employment and they're going to need income support. So we're going to do some of that. And these are just two cases of really thousands of cases. I think Kathy's identified 24 where if the person were returned to their country, they would be at risk of incarceration or worse. These things were not thought through. And aside from losing the editorial, we're really putting people and their families at tremendous risk here. Okay.
I'm just going to jump on that, Bill, to say things. One, it's actually, since you and I talked, I've had a further talk. I would say the universe of people who are really in danger of being sent back to places where they will face reprisals for having worked for the United States is now about 36. And I think that's the thing that I think people need to understand is that we are betraying people whom we recruited to work for us. They are the collateral damage. And, here's Donald Trump, who talked about what a terrible mess the withdrawal from Afghanistan was and how we left people behind. And really, this could be his personal Afghanistan. I mean, you're really throwing people to the wolves who did nothing but everything right. And I will say that I think what the National Press Club is doing is a fantastic model of the kind of solidarity that Paul talked about, where we can coordinate with our colleagues and try in our own small way to respond to these crises. But it's really terrible. And I think I'm just going to read one line from one of these cables from this is from Nigeria, where there's a lot of terrorist activity. And the diplomat there wrote, VOA Hausa, which is one of the local languages, VOA Hausa's outreach plays a key role in neutralizing extremist messaging. The vacuum caused by no VOA Hausa counter-messaging will be filled by bad actors' narratives. And we've just opened the door to that. And at the same time, what kind of message are we giving the rest of the world that if you come and work for the United States, we just mic drop you? I mean, when we're done with you, I don't know why anyone would ever want to work for us again.
It's a terrible own goal.
I think you both raise excellent points. I think the difference And I think there is a difference. I think it would be tempting for any journalist watching this to say, oh, give me a break, because the media industry has gone through a massive contraction. Thousands of journalists have lost their jobs. People get laid off in the industry every week. What is different about the US AGM companies? It's just another media organization losing reporters. That's just not news anymore. The two things that I do think distinguish it is the purpose of those organizations was to provide the advantages of a free press that we enjoy every day to countries that don't have a free press, right? So the absolute information lifeline to an audience that otherwise would be subjected to just garbage every day. That's one distinction. Then the second one is exactly the one you talk about, that because of its specialization in local languages, you need people here who have those specializations. They come on visas, and because of the audience is in a country, and therefore their home country is repressive. So you're sending them back to a repressive regime. They can't go out and get another job here, right? I mean, so I do think there are huge differences. That means that advocating for those people, let alone the fact that they have 10 people around the world who are in prison, 10 journalists around the world in prison, makes it incredibly worthwhile. But I think it's probably fair to say losing jobs in journalism anymore isn't exactly news. And then the related piece of it that I would like to see, honestly, if I had my wish list of what would you like to see on this matter in the next 6 months, is Congress exerting its authority over institutions that they have chartered, fund, approved of, and we know behind the scenes in many cases on both sides of the aisle are encouraging the lawsuits that are trying to keep these US AGM agencies alive. And yet, will you hear anybody in the Republican Party on Capitol Hill stand up for them? No, because their powers of chartering and their powers of allocating the money have been completely usurped, and they've done nothing about it. So the argument that has been most successful for the VOA petitioners in federal court has been that this was an extraordinary and obvious case of executive overreach, because the White House doesn't control the allocation of the money. Congress does. So where is Congress? Congress can step in and stop this. Congress effectively owns these organizations, and they've given up any supervisory authority over them whatsoever. And that, to me, is an abomination. But it also, if I could change anything, I would have Congress step up and say, I'm sorry, these are ours, and we're going to run them as we see fit.
Great point, Paul. Mike, we have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to run it over just a little bit to make sure everybody gets a final word here. Mike, do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think I see this as the sort of like one thing that I really want to leave you with today, which is the biggest threat to press freedom in the United States right now is normalization, right? We're watching that access shrink, legal threats multiplying, online harassment escalating, public trust in media eroding, and that's all happening slowly enough and quietly enough that we risk accepting it as the new normal. A reporter who gets locked out of White House events, a nonprofit newsroom sued for doing its job, public broadcasters losing funding, and journalists in small towns targeted for, covering school board meetings. Each of those may not be a national crisis on its own, but taken together, they point to something deeper, or an environment that's growing narrower, more dangerous, and less protected by the day. So if we don't mean that clearly, and if we don't respond with that urgency that we've been talking about, we really risk waking up in a few years and realizing that we've lost something way more than what we thought. So I think the fight now is about holding the line before that line quietly disappears.
Excellent point.
Yes, much appreciated. Thank you, Mike. Jim Shudo. Okay.
Hi, just a few quick thoughts. Kathy, I wonder if you have some stories, and maybe Bill, you as well, of former VOA journalists returned to their home countries and facing danger now. Please put me in touch, because I don't I don't think CNN has done either enough of that or any of that. And I think it's a story with a couple moving individual cases that we could highlight. Just one request, if you don't mind, if you could help me
Sure.
find my way to some of those folks, I would happily do a story tomorrow on it.
Great, Jim. Thank you.
Got it.
A couple other just quick thoughts. The point about the loss of voice in Africa is I've been teaching a class this year up at Jackson at Yale, and one of the students did a piece that really dove into the connection between China and Russia in Africa in the news and mis and disinformation space, and how the Chinese satellite and distribution network there does a solid to the Russian RTs of the world by transmitting their signal to millions and tens of millions of homes in Africa. And of course, that was already existent before we backed out of that space. And it is a really powerful phenomenon that's happening there. And again, as I think you said, Bill, it's an own goal in terms of soft power and information. Two other quick point. One, in terms of what the corporate pressure will be, I always tell folks that this happened in the first term, and people forget about this to CNN. But when AT&T, and you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with this, but when AT&T wanted to buy Time Warner, the Trump administration got its DOJ to stand in the way of that merger, even though it was a merger-friendly DOJ. Ultimately, the merger was approved, but as Randall Joyce, the CEO of AT&T, told us at the time, it cost him $500 million in legal fees, right? So sometimes it's just squeezing you for money in a way. Now I think, they're obviously getting better at this, and that's why Sherry Redstone, it seems, is doing what she's doing. So at some point, if I hate to say it, but among friends, if there's another reorganization of our WBD owners and assets, you'll very likely run into the same buzzsaw. The final thing I would say is just to raise my hand. If we decide and want to be more vocal in terms of what's required to stand up to this, I'm happy to add my voice to that in any way that I can. I am not shy, and there are a lot of things I'm scared of, but attacks from this administration is not one of them. And I do believe that the fear is insidious, right? And it happens, and we all see it every day from colleagues and fellow organizations and so on. So if you need a volunteer, I will happily raise my hand.
Thank you, Jim. I'm sure we will be calling on you, but we appreciate that sentiment. Let's see. Jody has not had a chance for a final thought or point.
Yeah, I'll just be quick, and this follows up on what Jim was just saying, what Paul said, and Kathy too, that we do have constitutional protection, and right now it may not feel like it, but we as journalists and the press club and news organizations, for those of us who work for them, need to remember that, and we need to go to court if we need to go to court, and we need, we, unlike a lot of journalists around the world, we have. We are protected under the Constitution, and we have legal protection, and we have to fight to keep that.
To quote the president, fight, fight, fight.
Fight.
I think we're at our end of time, but one of the things I hope everyone's gotten a chance to say their last words. And one of the things I had started by saying is that we were going to talk about cases as much as we were going to talk about numbers and general concepts. And so we have not touched on a case that's very important to me, and we'll end with that. So this is the case of Austin Tice, a journalist held for 12 years overseas in Syria, and a big sort of breakthrough in the last month or so is that the government of the United States, after 12 years, agreed to bring the family in and show them all of the information that the government has known since the days Austin was taken, all the way through to the fall of Damascus. And I spoke with Mrs. Tice. She sorted through that information. She was there for 16 hours one day. I think this was across 3 days, but one day was extraordinary. She looked at that with her husband, and she has a much better understanding of kind of what happened now. But the breathtaking part about all of this is the Tices were here in December of 24 in this room that we're in, Jody and I are in right now. And they said they had a kind of I'm going to use the word whistleblower, but a person in government who had shared with them that there was a lot of information. The United States government, the White House press corps, White House press team then responded from the podium saying they didn't know of any new information. They didn't have any information on Austin. 5 months later, they're showing a massive set of documents showing which prisons he was in, showing what times he was moved to prisons, showing when he got medical care. None of this has been shared with the public. None of it has been shared until now with his family. And this is what families are pushing against. Misdirection and misleading in the most lavish and dramatic fashion. So while I am heartened by the fact that we now know a lot more, we still have a huge problem in finding Austin now. And so I'm hoping that we have good news in the year to come about this case of the only American journalist currently being held overseas. I want to thank the audience for being with us today. I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us and sharing their thoughts and their experience. It's 90 minutes, and I think it could have gone 900 minutes. I'm grateful to all of you. Signing off for the Press Freedom Center at the National Press Club and recognizing it's another World Press Freedom Day for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you.